Everyone, and welcome to VegfestUK London, the Pro-Intersectionalist Conference at VegfestUK London. Thank you very much for getting up early this morning in time for this talk and session, which is going to be on Jainism. My name's Sagar Shah. I've been a member of the Jain community. As far as I know, my family's been vegetarian for over 800 years, and I've been vegan for about 9 years and been running with my colleague Minal, who's sitting at the front here, a vegan campaign group within the Jain community. Just so I can get a better understanding of the audience, I was just wondering, how many of you put your hand up if you're actually from the Jain community? Okay, cool. Put your hand up if you've heard about Jainism and you know what Jainism is. Great. And hands up if you don't really know anything about Jainism and this is one of the first times you're going to learn about it. Great. Okay. Mixed audience. What I hope over the course of the next hour or so, everyone who's learning about Jainism for the first time will get some useful insights, and that everyone that's knowledgeable about Jainism will also learn something interesting too. So the talk is going to be, I'm going to aim to talk for about half an hour, and there are three things that are going to get covered in the talk. So first is an overview of Jainism and what Jainism is. The second is the principle of Ahimsa, or non-violence, which is it's a principle that Jains take very seriously. And then at the end, we'll talk a bit about the vegan movement in the Jain community. There's going to be lots of time at the end for questions and answers, but I'm not feeling very well today. So if anything I say is unclear or I use some language that doesn't make sense, please feel free to stop me and ask a question at any time. Right, so what is Jainism? Well, Jainism is a religion that originated in ancient India. I'm not sure if you can see the map of India on the screen, but in the top right-hand corner, there's a sort of dark blue blob. And that's the ancient kingdom of Magadha, just south of Nepal. And it's a place around 2,500 years ago. There are a lot of enlightened teachers who were teaching non-violence and were very, very popular. Now, one of these teachers is very famous. His name is Siddhartha the Buddha, and he's got the people that were following his teachings became known as Buddhists, and there are about 500 million of them now today. Whereas there was also another teacher that was there slightly earlier than Buddha, and his name was Mahavir, and it's the followers of his teachings have become what are known today now as Jains. But unlike Buddhism, which spread far around the world and didn't actually end up staying in India, Jains, for much of their history, were more concentrated in India. And now there are about 4 million to 8 million Jains worldwide. We don't have a great deal. The data we've got to actually know how many Jains there are isn't fantastic. But we think there are about 4 to 6 million in India, and there are diaspora groups in East Africa, Europe, mainly the UK, North America, and Australasia. Now, the reason why I think a talk about Jainism is interesting and relevant to a vegan festival is the intimate relationship that Jains have with vegetarianism or non-violence through food. So if you look at historical accounts of when vegetarianism first seemed to emerge as a common practice among humans, it was around 2,500 years ago, and it was taking place in ancient Greece with the Pythagoreans, and in ancient India in the Magadha kingdom among followers of these great enlightened teachers. And so Jainism was arguably one of the most important of those cultures, teaching non-violence. And pretty much since its inception as an organized movement, there's virtually no evidence of any Jain leader ever eating flesh. So Jainism has largely been a vegetarian movement for about 2,500 years, and it gives me immense pride to be continuing part of this movement now, promoting the veganism in the UK. So what is Jainism about? Well, the word Jain originates from the Sanskrit word for Jina, which means a conqueror. Now, the word conqueror doesn't quite seem to be consistent with a culture that's supposed to be highly focused around the principle of non-violence. But when Jains refer to themselves as being conquerors, the things they're seeking to conquer are the inner enemies, the anger, ego, greed, and deceit. And the aim is by getting greater control and eliminating these passions from yourself, you can achieve liberation. Like lots of other religions originating from India, Jains believe in a soul, and we'll come into a bit more detail on this a little bit later. They also believe in the concept of karma and reincarnation. So put simply, every living being has a soul, and they're stuck in this endless cycle of birth and death. And through the principle of karma, which is essentially a principle of cause and effect, one's actions, one binds karma through the actions they take, and the actions you take can determine the path for you going forwards. Essentially, if you do good deeds, you'll end up binding positive karma. If you do negative ones, you'll end up binding negative karma, and that will affect the circumstances that you face later on in your life, the type of rebirth you might encounter. And the goal of Jains is through actions, through conquering the inner enemies, these passions, to eliminate their karma and approach liberation or nirvana or moksha. So in terms of Jain's views towards other living beings, there is a belief that every living being is a soul. And that extends not just to mammals or to birds or to reptiles, but it applies to every single living being. So plants, insects, even bacteria. There's also the belief that all souls are equal. And they're equal in their capacity to, through individual effort and shedding karma, to achieve this goal of nirvana or liberation. And Jains also believe that all life is bound together by mutual support and interdependence. Put simply, by harming other living beings, you end up harming yourself. So there are, I'd say, there are lots of Jain principles that are important, but there are three in particular that I think make Jainism unique, or perhaps not so unique, but I think they're unique principles of Jainism. So the first is Ahimsa, or non-violence, and this is a principle that Jains take very seriously. So for Jains, non-violence can be through thoughts, through words, not actions. So it's insufficient just not to avoid doing violent things. To think about a violent act or imagine carrying out a violent act to someone from the Jain view of the world is a form of violence. Another very important principle is non-possessiveness. And this is the idea that our attachment or possession over both physical objects and other living beings is harmful for our progress. So if you were to think about, if you're born, you end up, when you're born, you come with nothing, and when you die, you end up leaving with nothing. Your accumulation of physical objects throughout your life effectively involves you taking things from someone. So I live in a house. The space that I'm occupying, that I've treated as my own, is actually land that could be used by other living beings. And everything that's in my home, or everything that's in my possession, at one point would have been stolen from nature or from someone else. So the idea is that by accumulating possessions, we end up causing harm. And by avoiding possessiveness and avoiding accumulating possessions, you can avoid the harm that you impose on the world. And then the concept also extends to other living beings. And the way in which I look at this is that so one, rejecting possession over other living beings means that slavery or owning animals isn't really consistent with Jainism. But also, in order for you to have such a relationship with another living being, it necessarily involves some sort of ego or deceit or sense of ownership. And that can be quite negative for your relationships with other living beings. Another very important principle of Jainism is the principle of Anekantavada, which is a theory of many-sidedness or the multiplicity of viewpoints. So the basic principle is that the world is very complex and it's very, very hard to understand. So we cannot necessarily understand the full complexity of reality. We can only see it from one particular angle or one particular side. So there's a great tale that's used to explain this concept, and this is the tale of the elephant and the blind men. So you have there's an elephant in a room, and a king took 5 blind men to the elephant, and each were given a different part of the elephant that they were examining. One person felt the legs of the elephant and thought the elephant was a tree trunk. Someone touched the ears and thought it was a fan. Someone touched the tail and thought it was a rope. Now, I guess the way to look at it is the absolute truth is the being that they were touching and viewing was an elephant. But from their perspective, they only saw one part of the elephant, and their individual perspectives were, in their own way, correct, but they were only one part of the bigger truth. So the principle of Anekantavada, I think, is a great principle for helping harness tolerance and understanding among people that don't necessarily share the same perspective of you. You can see things from different angles, and you can both be true, but both not necessarily have a full understanding of what's going on. So here's a quote. I'm just going to go a bit more into the principle of nonviolence. So here's a quote about Ahimsa in Jainism and the treatment of animals. So, all breathing, existing, living, sentient creatures should not be slain, nor treated with violence, nor abused, nor tormented, nor driven away. And a wise man neither inflicts violence on other living beings, nor induces others to do so, nor approves of their doing so. So in Jainism, it's not sufficient, not even just to not carry out violence yourself. If you're benefiting from someone else carrying out violence or paying someone to do it indirectly, you're also committing violence yourself. Now, the picture here is of some Jain monks, and for most of Jain history, it's the monks and nuns that sort of carry the flag of Jainism and represent living Jain values in a much stronger way than most lay people do. So monks and nuns, they give up all their physical possessions, except from one sect of Jainism, they keep an item of clothing, a shawl to wear. They will keep an alms bowl to eat from. They will have a book holder, and they will have a small brush, and they'll use that brush to sweep the floor in front of them as they walk so they don't harm small insects on the ground as they walk. They take a strict vow never to go on forms of transport and only to walk from place to place. Again, partly due to the fact that historically traveling would have involved traveling on an animal or via an animal, which had been seen as inconsistent with the principle of non-violence. And the way in which Jain monks and nuns eat is also very interesting. So they, the principles, they'd go and seek alms from Jain householders, but the rule is that if the food has been made specifically for the monks or nuns, they're not actually supposed to take it. So the idea is that you'd go to someone's house. That person would be very privileged to have a monk or nun visiting, and of the food that they would have made, they'll give a very small amount. If they've made like one chapati, they'll give a quarter of a chapati to a monk or nun. And the idea is that by only consuming stuff that households were producing anyway, they are not causing the households any harm, and they're not creating any harm, additional harm through the food that they're taking. But they're also helping the householders eat a little bit less and cause a little bit less harm through the food that they eat. As I'm going to come on to a little bit later, the Jain diet is also quite restrictive, and so there are very strong rules about what Jain monks and nuns eat and don't eat. And essentially, by having this symbiotic relationship and visiting householders, the monks and nuns actually help ensure that, because it's such a privilege to be able to offer food to monks or nuns, and you want to be able to give food to them if they come, you would stick to the same non-violent dietary practices at home on the chance that monks and nuns might visit you, and that helps bring the ethics level up among the households. So a great Jain, an ex-Jain monk called Satish Kumar he refers to Jain monks and nuns as sort of like bees visiting flowers. They go from flower to flower, taking a little bit of nectar, but while they're doing so, they spread pollen and these great principles of non-violence and great teachings as they go along. So there are only around 11,000 monks and nuns compared to a lay community, so just normal people that work of 4 to 8 million. And Jainism is quite practical. The monks and nuns have a very high bar for avoiding violence, whereas it's recognized that in order to live, it's necessary to carry out some violence. So we all need food, and that food involves potentially harming plants. So Jains try and avoid, they try and categorize different types of life form so that you minimize violence to living beings with the highest sensory capacity. So that means avoiding using animals for food as far as possible, and going to plants, but even within plants, avoiding the ones where the most harm may get caused. I'm going to come to this a little bit later on the specific plants, but the basic principle is if you were to take a fruit from a tree, the fruit itself is just the ripened ovaries of the tree. Like it's an instrument that bears seeds. You can take a fruit, you can take an apple without killing the tree. You can even eat the apple, and you can still spread seeds. You're not actually killing any life. Whereas there are other plants where, in order to harvest them, you end up killing the entire thing, and potentially damaging the ecosystem around them if you have to uproot the soil. Jains also engage in a lot of activities to support other living beings. So Jains are big donors to animal sanctuaries. They also do a lot of charity work, funding schools and hospitals in India. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, vegetarianism hasn't been enough for the Jains historically. So Jains have avoided having honey, and if you think about how you would get to honey, it would effectively involve smoking a beehive and quite violently taking away a source of food for the bees. So that was a clear no-no. Eggs were also avoided. I mentioned how for harvesting root vegetables, you'd end up having to kill an entire plant. But Jains also avoided some other plants like aubergines and figs. So aubergines, so I guess Jains would seek to avoid eating plants where there'd be lots of insects inside. And with lots of fruits and vegetables, it's actually quite easy to observe from the outside whether worms got in or whether there's been an infestation of some sort. Whereas actually with aubergines, if a worm goes inside an aubergine, the skin seems to be without a blemish. So often aubergines would be harvested with insects, and by eating them you might be doing more damage than other plants. So Jains traditionally avoided eating aubergines. And I'm not sure if all of you know this fact about figs, but actually every fig has got a symbiotic relationship with a specific species of wasp. And in most figs, you'll actually find that there are some dead wasps inside. Now, it's not some of them. I think it's related to the process of how wasps are born. That after laying eggs, I think the female wasps just end up inside the fig. So it's not necessarily the case that you're killing them by eating a fig. I think they'd be dead regardless of whether they'd be eaten. But recognizing this relationship between the insects and the plant, Jains ruled out eating figs. The Jain dietary laws also involved ruling out eating after dark, and the basic principle is that if you eat during the day when it's sunlight, you can see what you're eating and see what you're doing. Eating after dark would often involve having to light a fire, which would be more likely to attract small insects who would end up killing themselves and would generally be more violent. So while eating during daylight would be considered superior. When it comes to water, historically Jains were unique in only drinking boiled and filtered water. And one of the reasons for this was the idea that there were bacteria in water, and these bacteria would be multiplying. And there's recognition that if you were to drink the water after bacteria had multiplied, you would end up killing more living beings than if you were to simply boil the water first and kill them when there are fewer amounts of them. So Jain, and then there are also health reasons for doing it. But a lot of other Indian communities would often find it difficult to host a Jain because of all the different dietary laws they would subscribe to. Now, many modern vegans see Jainism and think, wow, with such a great principle of non-violence, surely all Jains are vegan. And interestingly, that's not actually the case. Historically, milk was being considered acceptable for Jains. And so the baseline diet for most Jains, and certainly for me when I was born, was a lacto-vegetarian diet. And I think, well, I'm going to go into two reasons for this. I'm working on trying to change this at the moment. So I think the two reasons are health and observability. I'll go into observability first. So in today's world, we have transportation and refrigeration, which means you can have a cow that's produced milk, and that milk can be consumed many hundreds of miles away from when it was produced. Whereas actually in historical India, in the environment where Jainism evolved and emerged, that wasn't the case. So transportation wasn't very good. It was very hot, so milk would spoil very quickly. And there wasn't really the technology to refrigerate milk. And what that meant is that if you were to be taking milk, you would have had to live very close to the cow that was producing it, and you'd be able to observe firsthand the welfare conditions under which the cows were looked after. So essentially, you would be able to discriminate about whether or not the way in which the cow was treated was consistent with your own principles of non-violence. And in fact, there were quite strict laws or strict rules on what was considered acceptable. And that would involve making sure a calf would get fed sufficiently before anything was taken for humans. And it would be inconsistent with Jain principles for Jain families to let go of cows once they were no longer productive, or to kill the male calves. The other reason why I think historically Jains may have been consuming milk is the reason of health. So based on historical counts of vegans, I think there have been vegan communities that started and then have gone into extinction, possibly because of a lack of knowledge of the B12 nutrient. And one of the reasons why the vegan movement has been thriving now and is able to, because we're aware of the problems that B12 deficiency can cause, and we're able to supplement and have the ability to synthesize it and get it from bacteria. Now, it's quite possible that there may have been groups of Jains that were seeking to avoid milk, but then either suffered very bad health consequences or just went out of existence. And so that's one other reason why historically Jains may have been consuming milk. Now, none of these reasons apply in modern India or modern any other country for that matter. So the main reasons why I think Jains continue to consume milk are two: ignorance and inertia. So given historically it was culturally acceptable to drink milk, that social norm just continues. They're foods which are made out of milk products that people enjoy and continue making. And the other thing is that Jains are a quite well-educated group, and they moved away from farming areas towards urban areas. And with the availability of transport and refrigeration, there'll be some ideal of how cows are treated that would exist in the backs of minds of people, and they wouldn't be aware of the violence that is taking place and how it's inconsistent with Jain principles. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the vegan movement in the Jain community. So recognizing the violence in milk production, an increasing number of people in the Jain community have been turning towards a vegan diet. Now, initially that was starting off in North America and the UK, but there is an increasing vegan movement among Jains now in India. When the kind of movement to try and encourage Jains to move towards a vegan diet started, I think there was a lot of resistance from Jain community leaders. Partly is because kind of young people in general, particularly in the West, aren't often that interested in Jainism or attending Jain community events. And so if you're, as it is, following Jainism is quite strict, and if you're going to add another label or another degree of strictness on it, I think there was a fear among leaders you're just going to push people away. And it would make it harder when they're all already struggling to attract people to come to events. But I think there's been an increasing recognition, particularly among young people, that consumption of dairy products is violent and is completely inconsistent with Jain principles. And with a growing demand and recognition of people asking questions about the serving of dairy products at events, a lot of Jain organizations, particularly those focused around young people, are now vegan-friendly and running exclusively vegan events, even if the people running them aren't always vegan themselves. There's a recognition that it is the right thing to do. And it's actually quite amazing, some of the events we've been having in London, where like there'll be something which isn't necessarily highly related to do with Jainism. It'll be like a Indian community folk dancing event, but with an amazing range of vegan cheesecakes and vegan milkshakes of different Indian flavors. Now, the Jain Vegans group that I'm involved in has been running a vegan pledge during a Jain festival. It's the Jain Festival of Forgiveness, and it's called Paryushan. And it's an 8-day festival, 8 or 10-day festival, where Jains try and live by Jain principles more strongly. So most Jains would end up fasting in some way during the 8-day festival. And so we are running a vegan pledge, encouraging everyone and all Jain organizations to encourage their members to try and go vegan for the festival and think about going vegan later on. And we had near universal support from every organization we spoke to and engaged with. They were completely supportive of encouraging their members and thought it was the right thing to do. So it's looking positive for the vegan movement, especially in the UK. And more recently, there's been a really big boom in health-motivated vegans. So there's a lot of people from the South Asian community who are suffering from diabetes or high cholesterol. And there have been a series of talks about how through following a whole food, plant-based diet, along with some other lifestyle changes, you can reverse or control some aspects or some elements of type 2 diabetes. So these have been immensely popular among older members of the Jain community. And there are many, many who have turned vegan for health reasons. And once they've made the switch for health reasons, are more open to recognizing the ethical reasons and are very supportive now about promoting a vegan lifestyle. So it's looking positive, and I think that's it for my talk. So thank you very much for taking time to come out this morning and listening this morning, and I'm now open for questions if you have any.